guys. So, to plant or not to plant, there is no question. Shakespeare did not say that, but he would have. He would have. But we're, in the past we've had some key takeaways that I've said. If you forget everything else I tell you today, try and really remember this. And I think this is kind of that idea of, when unsure, plant more plants. When unsure, keep getting that ground covered. So in the past, when I was talking about gardening methods, I said, let's just try to keep that ground covered. This is where you see farmers using cover crops for fertility, because they know that those roots in the ground are taking the photosynthesis, taking all these things, and feeding the microbes down below. So keeping that ground covered and that diversity of plants is gonna help lead to resilience. So when we were also talking about site preparation, I was talking about different materials to fill your beds with versus just using one type of topsoil or whatever. And now, when I'm saying when unsure, plant more plants, this is again a soil health principle that has been a sound science research of the more I keep roots growing in the ground, the more I have plants growing, the better that fertility is. So sometimes you think, oh, roots in the ground is gonna be taking away from the nutrition of my plant. When we do this correctly with some companion planting, which we'll be talking about in a second here, we're able to build this ecosystem. So all year round in our garden, we want not only to have one type of plant, but we want to have all these different things. We want bugs, we want worms, we want, little critters eating each other. So these predator-prey relationships are all over in our world, where you're seeing birds eating, you think about fireflies. How many of you guys remember growing up and seeing tons of fireflies all over? How many of you see fireflies now? Yeah, so this is exactly what I'm talking about. It's a great example of understanding that sometimes when we kill off our dandelions, when we kill off certain different things, it can lead to a ripple effect in other areas that we didn't even realize. So having leaf litter on the ground and covering the ground, that's where fireflies go dormant through the winter. So if we don't have that covering on the ground, we don't have spots for them to hide and burrow, then guess what? We're not gonna get those fireflies the next summer. So building the environments for them is what I'm saying within this. Now, this is the topics we're gonna be going through today. If you guys want, there's some more chairs back there. Thank you, Leah. So we're gonna be going through specifically for southeastern Wisconsin. We have a lot of times gardening videos out there, lots of information out there, but it's not necessarily cold hardy. I had to scrape my windshield this morning. I mean, let's be real. So we're gonna go through companion planting, succession planting, herbs and vegetables, really highlighting tomatoes, and then my personal favorite, which is why I bolded it, is native edible perennials. And we'll be talking a little bit about where to get these things. So, and then flowers, plant care, seed starting, all sorts of good stuff. I'm scratching lots of surfaces. If you guys have any questions throughout this class, throughout the program, or even afterwards, I'd rather in the moment you come grab me and say, or come raise your hand and say, hey, what about this, and make it applicable to you before you forget the question. So we're gonna go through this today. At any time you have questions or wanna learn more or have things you wanna know, just raise your hand and we'll answer that. So yeah, my name is Angie Jones, and I'll be sending you this presentation as well, because there's gonna be spots in there where I have links embedded for where you can get perennial edible natives, where you can find a nursery list, where you can find a lot of stuff. So just know we'll have the same presentation available to you to click through later. So first we're gonna go through companion planting. Now, have you guys ever heard of companion planting? I know the other week we had someone in here talking about three sisters. This is that idea of taking corn, beans, and squash, and that corn is gonna support the beans to climb up, and while the beans are gonna fix the nitrogen in the ground, so they're gonna help fertilize that plant with pulling that nitrogen out of the soil, because that's what that kind of nitrogen giver does from the beans. And then squash is living as that living mulch, shading out the weeds and protecting the soil. So this is a really common example that's been used for a long time through Native Americans, and combinations of this have been too, where maybe instead of doing squash, you do pumpkins or some other vining, low growing thing. But there's there's a lot of ways we can do companion planting. So another way is the idea of using strong scented plants to deter pests. I'm going to give a big list of this later, so I just gave one example here of using marigolds, because that's a really common one where maybe you have that just at the corner of your bed, but that strong scent is not only going to help pollinate, but it's going to help deter some of those rabbits and deer and stuff. So that said, everything, we're going to be talking about weeds and pests a lot more on the 4th week, so I'm going to be telling you even more about that subject in a little bit here. But another theory or like rule within companion planting is plants that go together grow together. So I don't know about you guys, but I like pizza. Tomatoes and basil grow beautifully together. And then when you grow different plants together, they can actually, and especially the plants that grow well together. So like some people might grow cucumber next to some sunflowers, and sunflowers and cucumbers actually compete for things, and they are not a good companion plant. So whenever you're wondering about it, you can, that's the nice thing about the internet, you can always look that stuff up and it's pretty readily available. But like here's some examples of some planting guides. So like for tomatoes, they say basil, marigolds, carrots, asparagus, celery, onions, lettuce, parsley, spinach. So there's a lot of things on these lists that you can just come back to and look at, and this is that Farmer's Almanac companion guide. So again, there's a whole bunch of things that they have a big list of that you'll get a link in this presentation too if you want to look back at it. So it's that idea of not everything is a companion, but if you can grow things that are gonna enhance each other, it might ease your burden throughout the growing season, keep that water retained, and help you with a lot of other, you know, a trickle of other benefits between water retention, pest reduction, weed reduction, because the Mother Nature, she wants the ground covered. That's why when we just have bare soil, you're gonna have weeds pop up, because that's how she wants it. She wants to move it further along in succession. What's your question?
When you talk about keeping your ground covered, you mean not just over the winter, I mean not after it's done planting, you mean the whole, just plant around the covering?
So keeping that ground covered ideally is living roots, like you know how in the Three Sisters they were saying using the squash to shade out the other ones.
Oh.
So like say I'm going to be pulling out my plants at the end of the season, maybe I try putting down a winter rye or like an alfalfa or daikon radish or different plants that are winter hardy, frost hardy, and that way I'm growing through the winter as well. So that's where keeping the ground covered, if it's not with a living plant, it's with a brown material. So that's like your leaves, your twigs, your straw, any plant that has gone through its whole life cycle. So even our toilet paper and our paper towels, all these things that were trees at one point have now died and are now a high carbon material. So that's how you figure out what a brown is. And again, we'll be talking about that a lot in 2 weeks from now, because I can't help but talk about compost at one point on this, and that's going to be a big piece to that. So going through that idea of succession planting. So when we're talking about keeping the ground covered all year round, some ways of succession planting are staggering your planting. So say you have a back patio and you want to do, or a back porch and you want to have a salad all summer. Well, maybe I plant a little bit of my seeds right away, and then I wait 1 or 2 weeks and I plant a little bit more of my seeds. And what's nice is some lettuces you can just cut and come back and more will keep coming up. But if you're doing a head lettuce, that's one where you cut off the whole head and then it's done. So depending on what kind of lettuce you're doing, you can still do it all at once, but either way, it's nice to have some staggering out, because in the summer, it's hard to grow lettuce. In the spring, there's less, it's cooler out, there's more shade, there's less sun, so it's a little bit easier to grow. So it's nice to kind of have that changing out of those timings. So simply staggering the plants of the same crop throughout the season every few weeks, rather than planting in your garden all at once. And you know, I said you can do your seedlings separately. You could even do all your seeds at once and only transplant a little bit at a time. Because once they start to go into that, once they're transplanted, they're really kind of set up for, okay, now you're in your home, you're gonna live here the rest of your life. Whereas when they're in their transplant, they're still a little bit weaker, they don't have everything that they need. So staggering your plants or different crops and planting multiple varieties within, sorry, I'm trying to read it and say it, but basically I'm saying you can either stagger your plants out for transplant or seeding, or you could try different varieties of things. So we're gonna be talking about that more on the next few slides. But plants that do well for staggering, where you're planting your transplants separately at different times, or planting your seeds separately at different times, are things like arugula, basil, beets, bok choy, broccoli, cabbage, carrots, cauliflower, chard, cilantro, collards, fennel, kale, clabberami, mustards, parsley, parsnips, radishes, spinach, and turnips. That sounds like a great salad. I don't know about you guys. But if you find any of those that you're like, oh, I love that one, maybe you write that down right now and you say, that's one of those things that I'm gonna grow multiple of. So if you are wanting to get more salads in your life, which it's a great way to help regulate your blood sugar if you eat a little salad before your meals, and it's nice if it's convenient right outside your back door in a container. That's a really great example of something that's not a hard plant to grow, something you'll probably want to eat and should eat, and you can do it even on your back patio if you don't have a lot of space. So that's definitely one in succession planting that I would do. Now, this is where I was kind of preemptively putting it on there, saying different varieties. So raspberries are a great example of where you can do multiple varieties, and instead of just getting a bunch of raspberries in June, you could do some everbearing varieties, where you have raspberries growing through late July and then another harvest in late August, and maybe even another harvest all the way out. I had a lady telling me she had a harvest all the way till November, which is just like, as far as raspberry goes, who doesn't want that? I don't know about you, but I will eat a raspberry before I put it in my basket almost every time. So this is, again, there's some preferred varieties for those everbearings, but really knowing that it's an everbearing, chances are you're gonna get a lot more opportunities to harvest versus just that crazy one flush. Down at the bottom down there, there's the University of Minnesota, growing raspberries in your home garden, kind of little comeback thing, because raspberries are one that they might die off after a while if you don't cut them back. So there is some maintenance things over time, but when you think about how much time it takes to start all these seeds every year and to do all these different annual vegetables, to have a couple things that are perennial for you really can help ease that pain. So we'll talk about that more in a little bit here. Now, herbs. When you're thinking about an apartment garden or a small type garden, herbs are one of my #1 recommended plants, because they're pretty low maintenance, and you can eat all the time. You're constantly able to harvest, pinch, come back, and get more out of it. Like basil wants to be pinched back, because anytime I cut off that one shoot, 2 more are gonna come off of it. So cutting back your basil is gonna be wanted, and same is true for most all of our herbs. There's a lot of herbs that are actually perennial, even in Wisconsin. So like chives, some types of lavender, I should maybe put a little asterisk on that, because like if you do English lavender, that's not necessarily hardy, but there are hardy varieties of lavender. Lovage, oregano, thyme, sage, parsley, which is a biennial. So again, sometimes maybe, especially in a spot where you have a lot of wind, or it can be a little harsher conditions, can maybe not come back every year. But tarragon, mint, and dill, I put an asterisk next to, because you can have them in a container and that's great, but they can sometimes be aggressively self-sowers or root spreading and invasive. So really maybe not putting dill in the middle of your garden or mint in your garden, and keeping those in containers or keeping them in a spot where you don't mind them spreading, because they are gonna spread, or they generally will wanna spread. Now there's some annuals on here like basil, cilantro, chamomile, fennel, marjoram, parsley, rosemary. In some cases, like in rosemary, you can take in those plants over the winter and like put them kind of as a house plant, and they aren't gonna do much, but they're gonna go into that dormancy, and then the next year can come back. Because a lot of, we're gonna go through these plants today, and we're gonna go through the perennials here. A lot of plants that are annual here can be perennial in warmer climates. That's where you'll see someone in California with 10-year-old geraniums, and you're like, how dare you? But I mean, that's just something to mention, as far as like, why are some places, like I've even gotten stuff at greenhouses where it'll say really nice big letters, perennial, and then I see on the backside for hardiness zones like 7 to 10, and it's like, well, that's not me, so that's still an annual. Now, harvesting your herbs just above the leaf node to encourage new growth. So I didn't include a perfect picture of it, but that's that idea of wherever your leaves are coming off, that branching, cutting right above that branching is gonna make it that much more bushier versus like a twig top hat to it. So keeping it right above that leaf branching, those leaf nodes. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Over on the side here, these are again kind of companion plantings that are nice for, oh boy. Give me a second here, you guys, sorry. Come on, my friend. Oh gosh, okay, there we go. There we go. So now we're gonna talk about some vegetables. And because this is a beginner's class, I'm not gonna go into all sorts of different vegetables and all things, but I think it's nice to know what are some ones that are considered easier, and knowing that not every plant is easy all year round. So like in the spring, radishes, turnips, all these salad lettuces, cilantro, which when cilantro goes to seed, that's coriander, if you're thinking of your spices. So you can actually you can grow cilantro, get some nice stuff, and then by the summer, or it'll start to bolt, and then those seeds you can use for seasoning too. You can use for your coriander and your Indian foods or Mexican foods and stuff. Onions and potatoes and peas are also really great, pretty easy to go in the spring, and you can usually, like especially for peas, you can get harvest pretty quickly off of it. So when you're growing with kids, or if it's your first time, to feel that little bit of, I'm eating this food that I planted, to taste that reward and success can feel really good. So having some quick turnover ones like radishes and peas, and even our lettuces can be nice to just taste your food that you've grown versus wait for all the end of the summer to harvest. Walking onion I have up in the spring. That is another perennial one for you. So if I will be bringing in on the last class here a bunch of plants that I have extra of, and if you guys want to bring in plants that you have extra of, but I guarantee you I will be bringing in walking onion, because I have my great grandma's walking onion that has been just like passed around in our family and is obviously pretty hardy. So the summer zucchini, summer squash, kale, basil if you transplant. Green beans are a super easy one. Cherry tomatoes are a nice one too. These are things that, again, you can do a bunch of other things as well, but just to have some maybe feeling of success and feeling less overwhelmed of, why did this plant not work out for me? Because you're gonna learn every year something. I am never gonna know it all. But the more I plant and grow, the more I learn about my land, the more I learn what works well in a certain area, and then I can grow from there. And then it's nice too if you go around, and I got a little bit of each of these, and even though I think I picked this at like beginning of June, and it still is, or end of June, yeah, because I was starting to get my tomatoes in, little tomatoes in, I was starting to get a few green beans, and salads, I could just keep coming back every day. That salad bowl is one of my favorite things for you guys to plant. Go ahead, Joan.
So it's okay to put it in now, the spring stuff?
So you could get away with almost all of these in a cold frame, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. We might still be, like I said, I had to scrape frost off my window. We had a pretty hard frost this morning. So I would just be mindful on some of these to keep some sort of protective around it still. Maybe not totally just bare open in the ground. And that's where I'd much rather it be a little warmer than a little too cold. So I'll be talking about that more when we talk about like seed starting too. Now, tomatoes. I kind of had to make a big deal about tomatoes because if there's one thing people want to grow in general, it's tomatoes. It's the most popular homegrown vegetable. Now, when buying tomato plants, choosing a sturdy plant that is up to a foot tall is kind of a good idea. Sometimes, especially towards like the end of May, beginning of June, you'll see really tall plants with big spaces in between their leaves and kind of spindly looking spines to it. No matter how much you want to nurture and take care of the plant, and you totally can, get it back to a beautiful, abundant plant. Just starting yourself off with a really strong transplant is just setting yourself up for success. So picking all the fruit and bringing it indoors before the first frost at the end of the summer, that's kind of, typical. So when I see hard frost coming, even if I have green tomatoes, I'll pull all those off and then I'll put them in like a cardboard box in my garage or inside and let those ripen up off the vine versus letting them go through a frost and get mushy. So starting tomato from seed indoors if you're wanting to start tomatoes right now, like for this year from seed, this is like right now, like this weekend, maybe like the next few days here, trying to get stuff started. And just know that there's tons of nurseries out there too, so don't feel that pressure to get all these things together to start your seeds. Sorry, Yvonne. So for disease resistance, seed catalogs use codes to know which tomato varieties are more resistant or tolerant of different diseases, and some garden centers and big box stores will even include this information on their signage. There's actually a nice little list, a big list actually, of different disease resistant vegetable varieties. Depending on what nursery I'm going to and stuff, I maybe will even have that link pulled up on my phone, because if they don't say it on the sign, I can sometimes look back at that and see, oh, is this a better variety for if I'm dealing with different, like deficiencies and stuff. So like if I've always had yellow leaves on my plant and different diseases going on my plant, maybe I try out a different variety. And that's what I will always tell people is learn from your failures. Don't just look at it as a failure, look at it as a lesson, because you did learn something from it. So that for that stronger, more vigorous plant, I'm showing a little photo down there of putting your roots in actually to the side, planting with a little bit of that furrow. I don't know if you can see, there's a little bit of like a furrow to it, and then cutting off some of those lower leaves and having it grow almost to the side and then up, because all of that little extra stem that you're bearing is going to start to grow roots off of it too and help with that stability of your plant. So that's a little hack just for with your tomatoes of starting it off on the side and pushing it upwards just to help it, give it a little bit more stability down below.
That just for tomatoes?
You could probably do this for some other things too. Tomatoes though is by far like the thing that you'll hear that like that with. I'm trying to think of what other ones you could probably get away with that on. Peppers, you could probably do that on too. Yeah, I would say tomatoes and peppers. And know that tomatoes and peppers are gonna be your biggest heat lovers. So get them in the hottest part of your garden. Get them, like last couple years we've had some really like dry, hot summers. Those have been some of the best tomato pepper years for us because they love that heat. Now there's two different types of tomatoes. There's indeterminate and determinate. Indeterminate are that vine-like structure, as in they can't determine where they're gonna go. That's kind of how I remember it. Whereas that vine-like structure, if you're doing trellising with those big tall cages and stuff, like if you're doing the cattle panel arch type thing or things like that, the indeterminate can be a beautiful way to keep it growing up. The only thing is you wanna be pruning these so that they're not putting all this energy to all these other directions. You want that fruit structure still going down that main line. So you'll see like one line straight and then you'll see two maybe shoots going off. The shoot above the main one, cut that off because that's what they call that sucker. That's where you're giving too many options for the plant to grow. Give it just one option for the plant to grow. But that said, they produce a steady supply of tomatoes over a longer period, making them more continuous harvest. Whereas the determinant, on the other side, those grow more like a bush or a tree. And so those are ones where you're getting that main compact form, and those are ideal for containers more so than using the other style because they're only gonna grow to like 3 or 4 feet tall at most. And the other pieces though, they're gonna have minimal pruning. You're not gonna have to be cutting back any of those suckers, and you're gonna get all of your yield in general at once versus over time. So usually like late July, early August, all through August is when you're getting a big harvest of tomatoes and you're like, what am I gonna do with all these tomatoes? And that's where you learn how to can and share with your friends and your neighbors. So that's just one, that's kind of the basic overview of indeterminate and determinate. Now, this is just a little picture going through of all of them. So the vine tomatoes you can see up on the top right there. The plum tomato is kind of just like your Roma tomato down on the bottom right. And then cherry tomatoes, those in general are always gonna be more of an indeterminate variety where they vine along. And that's where you gotta be looking out for I'm just trying to see if in that photo it shows you it really well. I don't have a great photo of that sucker thing, but it's that idea of whenever you're having two leaves coming off of your main stem, cutting off that middle one and leaving your bottom, your main one, to kind of branch off to the sides. Beefsteak tomatoes, those are what you would call, like, sometimes you'll see like a slicer as the name for it too. So that's up top, number 4. Striped tomatoes, those usually are considered an heirloom variety. What's nice with any time you get like a striped tomato, I would try to save seed from it, because generally heirloom striped tomatoes, you're gonna be able to plant that seed the next year and get that same tomato. Whereas if I'm planting a lot of these other varieties, unless it says heirloom or like non-hybrid type things on it, you're not gonna necessarily get the same tomato the next year, or you're maybe not even gonna be able to grow a tomato off of it, because sometimes, you know, unfortunately nature can be patented and hybridized and not able to grow it again. I shouldn't say that, nature cannot be patented, but they try. Now, there's down there too black tomatoes. This is something that's becoming more and more available, like Baker Creek Farm. There's different places that sell them. So that's kind of, if you want to try something fun and different. Same with number 6, the orange and yellow tomatoes. Those are considered more like less acid tomatoes. So they might be harder for you to can, depending on if you're just canning those, because you want a higher acidity for canning, but we'll talk about that some other day. And then bush tomatoes down at the bottom, you can kind of see they're growing off these big line bushes, and you aren't gonna have to cut off any others. Actually, if you cut back on bush tomatoes, it can often reduce your yield. So trying not to actually cut them back and just continue to prop them so that they can be supported, because all tomatoes are gonna need some support, because that's some heavy fruit hanging there. Now, edible perennials. Okay, I'll calm down. So Wisconsin has a variety of perennial edible plants that can thrive in this climate and contribute to a sustainable garden. So when we think about seed starting and getting all these things started, it can be overwhelming. But to have some things already in your ground that you don't even have to worry about and you know are gonna come back every year for you, it just is rewarding, you know, and it makes it so that you can share your abundance with your community. Like I said, that walking onion has lasted more than just my family. It's been spread many places, and it's nice because it's not like an invasive thing. And same with, like, if you look at rhubarb, asparagus, strawberries, black and red currants, raspberries, all these different varieties of it, that walking onion, oregano, elderberry, those are all some of my personal favorites that in general, you can find at a lot of our nurseries nearby, and they're gonna come back for you almost every year. And the other really cool part about it is eventually you can share that abundance with others, and you can share with your community. So in a few weeks from now, I'll be bringing in elderberry cuttings, I'll be bringing in some raspberries, and we'll be able to share some of that. But it's not even that I have that elderberry bush, it's that there's people who come to the Y here who have a massive bush that they kind of just let go, and I could take 100+ cuttings from it and it makes zero difference on their growth. So to me, this is God's design for our farming and for our community, where you have one seed, you grow that one plant, and then the seeds from that plant provide more than what you need, provide more than he gives you in abundance. So I think these are some of the nurseries in the area where you can get edible perennials. I have a big list on my website too of like breaking it down between low growing, mid-height, and different, just so sometimes if you're growing a big elderberry bush, you might have to like think about it, whereas if you keep it pruned back. So down here too, I have a little list or a little video I wanted to show of just different berries, because sometimes we think of raspberries, we think of strawberries, we think of blueberries and blackberries. But then there's other things like service berries, honey berries, pawpaws. There are so many berries that you can't get in a grocery store that are literally native to this area that we just don't see anymore. I think the more we can add these things into our landscape, it's not only gonna help us, it's gonna help others in our community with food insecurity and supplementing for nutrition. So that's kind of why I get obsessed with it, because I think it's a missing piece in a lot of our gardens. Just to have a few things that you can have every year a harvest from. Now we're going down towards the native plants. So why native plants? Well, native plants are what we're naturally here. So they are usually a more resilient plant to our ecosystem already. They are very good at keeping roots in the ground, so that's gonna store that carbon. They also are, in general, usually pretty drought tolerant because they've been adapted to our environment. They can really be a great way, especially in urban environments, to provide habitat for all those different living things. And especially attracting pollinators and other insects that are also native. So sometimes when you have a whole garden of like just zinnias or different ornamental varieties, then you're getting a lot of those ornamental bugs to go with it because that's what they want. Whereas if you're doing a lot of natives, then you already have a lot of the native predators to the pests of that plant. So you're just continuing to work with that ecosystem that's already in your area. And then that also makes it relatively low maintenance once established, and quite often you can get beautiful to look at all year round. I don't know if you guys remember last spring, there were a couple spots in the city where there were poppies. Do you guys remember that last May by like a water tower and a couple other areas by like the old Humane Society? There were some big like flower field things. Well, the city had hired tall grass restoration services to put in wild native habitats. And the only reason they included poppies in that, because they are not native, is because they knew they wanted some blooms that first year. So the first year, sometimes when you plant a lot of natives, you might not see it because they gotta get established first, and then in the future years, they get more and more beautiful. So just know if you do plant a bunch of native flowers, you might not see gorgeous blooms that first year, but especially like by those places that I just talked about this May, come take a look and see if you're, seeing some different flowers there. What's nice too is instead of having to like look for the right native for your land, a lot of nurseries work towards providing mixes because diversity is what leads to resilience, and when you can have a diversity of different flowers growing in there, it can really help just with that, again, all the things before, water retention, biodiversity for your pests, and so you have less pests and disease. So these are just some little examples that they had of mixes that they have, and these are just 3 of the plants in each of those mixes. They have a bunch more of different plants in those mixes. So again, just nice to know that there's already sometimes homework done for you. But now, remember that question you asked before about having stuff growing on the ground all year round? Mm-hmm. Down below here, this picture is almost every USDA person who goes to different farms and stuff has probably done this experiment, because when you're trying to sell a farmer on a seed that is not gonna be a crop that they harvest, that's a hard sell. Whereas if you show them that, hey, if I have bare ground on that right side, do you see how everything from that rain, so every one of these spots got the same amount of water. The one on the far right, nothing went into the bottom jug down below it. You see no water infiltrated. All of the water just ran straight off that land onto the jar in front of it, and what did it take with it? Minerals, nutrients, humus, microorganisms, and then the next layer over to the left one, you have a little bit of ground cover. Well, now just a little bit is underneath on the underneath jar down below, and still majority is running off, but it's slightly less brown. It's slightly less humus getting taken with it, slightly less of all those things that you need, those trace minerals. And then the further along we go, the more and more you have that leaf litter, that organic matter, all those little brown things covering your ground, the less that water is running off, and the more it's stopping, staying, and absorbing. So that's where I say cover your ground, because, and now, let's get to this last one, my favorite one. When you actually have roots in the ground, you have 0 runoff, and then the water that's infiltrating is not even taking anything with it, because you can see it's clear underneath almost. And then the one with just organic matter is showing a lot of that minerals and nutrients and humus is going down below. That's why it's brown down below it instead of that clear. So that water going through roots really does help clean our rivers, helps clean and hold on to that water. So this is where, again, when you're working with a farmer who is putting down chemicals and things, and they are right next to any other body, let's try and have at least your edges be covered with something so that water isn't running away from you. And if it is running away, it's running away clean and not taking your minerals and all these other things. Some native growing, some of my favorite, just a few inches tall, native growing perennials are wild strawberry, pussy toes, prairie smoke, wild ginger, and our state flower. Anyone want to say it? Yes. So that's my personal favorite is the violets, just because, hello, you gotta love it for Wisconsin. But that's something that, if you can, continue to add these plants to your environment, because even if they slowly grow, even if they aren't covering all of your land, you can just continue to let them spread, and they aren't necessarily gonna interfere with the rest of your plant's growth because they're so low growing. So the only reason, if those roots are in the ground, that it would compete with your plant is if it's growing above your plant and your plant can't get that sunshine, that photosynthesis. But to have something low growing is like a living mulch. Yeah, go ahead, Yvonne.
What was the ground cover in that corner?
On the top right one is violets.
No, I
The
mean-
middle one, oh, this one right here?
The very bottom, what's covering it that's so good for retaining the soil?
So that's just grasses right there. Those are just grasses in that. But any roots covering your ground in your plant, that is what's really the magic in that, is any type of, covering with roots. So if it's ideally a native perennial that you don't have to dig up every year versus one of these grasses that might get really tall and then go to seed and cover your plant. So native short growing, if there's another little piece that I can really plug for you, would be adding just a little bit of native short growing plants. Okay, now we're getting into some flowers. So flowers to grow in Wisconsin for year-round blooms. And know that these aren't not all native, but it's nice when you can have something year-round growing. So like cone flowers, on the top right there, that's still clematis. Those are a nice big vining thing that you can do over your trellises. And again, coming back every year for those clematises. Actually, all of those ones are gonna come back for you. So black-eyed Susans, daylily, sedums, Shasta daisy, aster. A lot of these, again, they're just pretty and they're pretty resilient, and they're gonna be able to get you year-round pollinators, year-round beautiful photos. And then we were talking a little bit before about plants that repel bugs as far as companion planting. So like marigolds is probably the most common one, but then even things like citronella grass, petunias, lavender, nasturtium, rosemary, basil, lemongrass, mint, catnip, lantana, bee balm. So like petunias and lantana, chances are any greenhouse you go to, if they just sell like annuals and stuff, they're gonna have those too for you. So what's nice is even if you go to like someplace here in town, like the Watertown greenhouse, you're gonna still be able to get some things that you can companion plant to repel some bugs. That said, it's all an ecosystem, right? So if you're dealing with a ton of mosquitoes every year, let's maybe think about like your neighbor's pond or like other things that are going on besides just your one plant of petunias. So know that this isn't always gonna be your magic perfect fix. I can't promise any mosquito reduction, but it's nice to have all these things to inhibit.
I have a question. When you're planting, say I'm planting my tomatoes, but I'm planting them in like a grow bag.
Yep.
Putting down a grow bag. Do I just take my marigolds and plant them around the outside of the tomato?
I would definitely have it in such a way, because those marigolds are gonna go off to the side. They're literally gonna fall over to the sides. So especially putting them right towards the edge and even kind of pointing them out of the plant, out of the pot a little bit, that's gonna help you so that you can have your tomatoes main grow. And really only having one of them. You don't need to do a ton to outcompete it, but just doing one in there is a really great way to, companion plant those two, even in just like a 5-gallon bucket or a grow bag. Yeah. Any other questions, quick? No? We're gonna keep moving along then. So plant care. I'm trying to make this as basic as possible. There is gonna be tons of different things I'm gonna be telling you in the future too about like weeds, pest, disease stuff. So this is just kind of the pullback basics. So watering daily, ideally in the early morning. Otherwise you can do it in the evening, or worst case scenario, just during the day. The reason I say that is because of evaporation. And when the sun is out in the middle of the day, a lot of that water that I'm putting down is gonna get evaporated. Whereas if I water my plants in the early morning, that water is gonna absorb and get below those mulch layers versus just evaporate off. Same with at night, it's one of those things that could get a little too cold and my plant might not like having cold water next to me. So it's kind of humanizing your plant and thinking, what do I want? I should probably drink a big glass of water right away in the morning, and so should my plant. Now, I have a little finger on here. Can you guys guess why I put a finger on for watering? Okay, so the reason I included a finger next to watering daily is because sometimes overwatering or underwatering, how do you know? Especially when at the surface level, it's easy to evaporate. If I stick my finger in, like to the top of it, like the first couple inches, then I can actually find out what is the moisture level down below that surface evaporation. Because sometimes it can be dry on top, and then I stick my finger in and it's completely soaked down below that. So before you water, checking a little bit deeper than that surface level, just to see, especially if we did get rain as well, or there's other factors to it and you're just not sure if you should be watering today. But if we haven't had rain in general, you're gonna water every day. You're gonna water every day during the summers, which this is where sometimes having a team or having that watering systems, like I was saying in our previous site prep one about, self-watering systems or irrigation, drip timers. Now, maintaining plants. When you have, like what I was saying before with raspberry canes, there are some things that are perennial or for flowers that prefer to get cut back. So when you're going through your planting, look at that care on the seeds and just see, is this one of those plants that I'm gonna wanna cut back at the end of the year, or am I gonna cut it a little bit and it'll come back twice as big? So a lot of plants have different care to them, but just taking that time to know that, okay, there are some things I might need to maintain and cut back a little bit more because it'll grow better. Now, pull and weed out plants that are overgrowing your preferred plant. We just kind of nailed that on the head before, where it's that idea of anything that's growing above my plant that's taking its sunshine away from me, I'm taking that out of the picture. I'm either pulling that out completely because it's too aggressive and is gonna come back right away, or I'm cutting it down to the base so it doesn't grow back again. So depending on, like, if it's one of those like terrible crabgrass type things, I'm yanking it all the way out, and ideally I'm covering it with either tons of wood chip or mulch or straw, or covering it with a new plant that I wanna grow in that spot. Ideally it's covering it with a new plant that I wanna grow in that spot. Now, plant care, we are talking a little bit about like tomatoes and cucumbers and all these things that sometimes they are gonna take a lot of that nitrogen from your plant. And this is where that companion planting can help alleviate the idea of crop rotation. Because if I have a giver and a low feeder and a high feeder all close in proximity, I might not need to rotate as much. But if I just have corn everywhere, I don't know, we see that quite a bit, then I maybe have to transition after a few years of it and do what they call a giver. So a giver is something that they call fixing nitrogen. So that's where I was saying before, those peas are pulling the nitrogen from the ground. So that's why so many people will grow like an alfalfa or a bean or a pea over the winter, or a winter rye even, because that's gonna pull that nitrogen and then make it in a plant's available form. Whereas these other plants are gonna take that nitrogen, but they can't pull it from the soil. Like they can't make that nitrogen in available form. And then low feeders are like kale, beets, onions, carrots, spinach, potatoes, parsnips, root crops. So some of these things are gonna help you in different ways. Like a lot of our root crops, they might help you with your compaction. So maybe if you're wanting to start off at the ground level and you're like, I don't necessarily have the best soil, I don't necessarily know how to improve it, maybe you start off with a lot of those nitrogen fixers and a lot of those low feeders. And then in the future, once that gets established, you go towards some of those, the ones that we want, like the tomatoes and the cucumbers and the cauliflower. But especially if you're having a struggle with any of those high feeder ones, know that that's maybe because those nutrients aren't in a plant available form right there. So we have all the nutrients we need in the world, like down below every soil in every part of the world, we have a lot of different minerals and nutrients. It's just having them in a plant available form. And that's where the biology, bacteria and fungi are some of the only organisms that can pull nutrients from sand, silt, clay, rocks, pebbles. So that's why having those ecosystems It's part of God's design. It's part of why we need to have these ground covers, to have those roots in the ground to pull from all of those minerals, the nutrients for your plant. Now, we were talking a little bit before about what can I start in spring. When we're talking about spring, I like to mention that, like, if you're doing, yeah, I did skip one, sorry. We're gonna come back to this. So, location, plant selection, and frost. It is better to wait a little longer than to plant too soon. And then I just wrote on there, technically the last estimated frost date is May 11th, but we might have an early one, might have a late one. That's the estimate. But there's sometimes people will use like milk jugs and use that for like their indoor pre-starting greenhouse cold frame. And that's kind of a nice way to get a head start on things, even if you're in an apartment or something. And then plants that can take a light freeze are things like spinach, lettuce, peas, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflowers, carrots, onions, parsley, Brussels sprouts, Swiss chard. Now, I have a little thing on the top corner there. We also had that the other week too, where it talks about planting calendar by zip code. So if you're unsure as to like when you should start doing these things, it's a nice little link there to just give you some reassurance as to when you can start. Now, this is where I was talking about cold frames. If I have that milk jug outside and it's just like not growing and it seems like it's getting too cold, maybe I have that milk jug and then I also have it inside another mini greenhouse thing, be it, I mean, I have used like, you know, at Aldi when you can get the big salad in the plastic box there, I will use that plastic box as a greenhouse for my seedlings because it's a nice big box and it's plastic, or I could use like if you buy a cake from Walmart or something and they give you that nice plastic dome over the top of it. All these things can be reused for greenhousing effect. So every time you add another layer of greenhousing, they say in general, on average, about 10 degrees difference for each layer added. So if it's gonna be 28 degrees outside and I have my plants in that milk jug, well then they're gonna be at about 38 degrees. And then if I have it in that milk jug and then inside a cold frame, then maybe that's gonna be almost to like 40, 45, 50 degrees. So it's not a perfect science, but in general, you can say about 10 degrees you're adding with each layer of greenhousing you're adding to it. I kind of think of it like each sweater I add, I'm adding another 10 degrees of body heat. And these are just kind of examples of how you do it. Like I got my windows replaced a while back and I said, let me keep all my windows. I don't know what I'm gonna do with it. And I ended up doing a cold frame thing, kind of like the middle one, where I just reused a bunch of pallets. But then what I also use it for after the spring cold stuff is I'll use it as a dehydrator. So for my compost and stuff, I'll dehydrate things to preserve the nutrients in it, or if I want to like dry out flowers or preserve other things, you can kind of use it as a solar dehydrator depending on if you want to see if you want to do it that way. So just something to mention. I also thought that was kind of a fun little hack of taking an old broken hose, and if you'd use PVC to cover your half houses, you could use that old broken hose to kind of clamp down the plastic. And again, you could use an old shower curtain for this. You don't have to go and like buy super fancy greenhousing equipment. It's anything that's gonna create that greenhousing effect. Do you guys have any questions on that? No? Okay, perfect. So labeling is pretty self-explanatory. I mean, people will use anything they got. But one thing I like to mention is, yeah, use what you have, but then consider over time, how is that gonna degrade? Or am I gonna pull this out in the fall? And often when we get the little like tags from the nurseries and stuff and we stick them in the ground, if you don't pull those out the next year, they're gonna still be there, but they might be broken and fragile and start to degrade, and then you're getting more plastics in your soil, which you probably don't want. So usually if I know I'm gonna grow a plant multiple years, I will make my own label out of, and I wanted to make a tutorial, I did not make it, but eventually I'll probably do that, where you take a soda can and you cut it open, and then I will take like a pen and put it over some newspaper or a styrofoam or something, and I'll write on what my label is and cut that out. And then I can put that on, a fork is what I've been using now because that's not gonna decompose, but I used to use like a popsicle stick. So like on the bottom right, you can see Liatris I have over there, because I grow up, they come back every year for me. So it's nice to have a little label with it. So I thought that was a fun hack. I felt really smart when I thought of that. But yeah, if you want to borrow that, you can. So like, I thought this was kind of funny how they use a piece of chalk for their label for basil. I'm like, well, one rain We're gonna be wondering what kind of basil that is. But when we're talking about seed starting, that is especially when you're gonna wanna label, because as much as you think, I'm gonna remember that, it's so easy, all seedlings start to look alike at the beginning, so definitely having labels next to it. Now, for seed starting, let me just look at my time here. Okay, so for seed starting, you can start without a heat mat, you can start without a grow light, you can start without all these fancy things, but they do help the efficacy. So if you want to make sure that you're giving your plants the best possible success of germinating and growing, starting off with a heat mat, which you can get heat mats from like Walmart and stuff. I want to say they're like $15, $10, $15, nothing like too crazy for an investment, but that mat is going to keep it from 75 to 85 degrees. And then once those seedlings start to emerge, once you start to see some green coming off, you can turn that germination mat off and move it to another one. So you don't need a ton of them because you can transition down. And then after those emergence, 70 degrees is kind of ideal, but warm soil is better than cold. So this is again trying to tell all these seeds like, hey, it's spring, it's ready for you, everything is warming up. So we're just kind of trying to create that fake. Now, providing an bright overhead light for the seedlings and turning on a fan occasionally just to strengthen the stems. I was talking to a lady here the other day and she's like, what do you use for a grow light? And I'm like, I actually love having like one grow light in my life because I will use that grow light outside of this for red light therapy because our body does need to like see the sun and stuff. So when I have all these other spectrums of light on my skin, it's also kind of a little health thing that you can do too versus just having these lights that you only use in the spring. So I'll show you guys a picture of that too in a second here, but just know that you can use the lights that are in your house and just have those lights on. They say 16 hours a day. So that's what you want is kind of like a lot of light for them for a long time. Now, after you have planted your seeds, you can thin or transplant seedlings after they're true leaves. So like those first set of big leaves start to appear. Because you might see just a tiny one and then eventually they'll get that second, the real leaf. So they first get fake leaves, then they get true leaves. But then you're wanting to also reduce your watering on your plants. So you might see that your plants without that bright light might lean towards the light. Then the stems of the plants will elongate and lean over. You can alleviate that in two ways. One, continuing to add more light available to them, so maybe adding in a grow light for them or bringing that grow light really close to them. Or two, you can continue to kind of bury them in a little bit. So sometimes when I'm starting seeds, I might start off with only half my container full, and especially for like tomatoes and peppers, I can add in a little bit more soil if they start to get a little leggy, especially if I'm starting a little too early. So some people, especially avid gardeners, might start their tomatoes a little too early, and then they're having to wait a long time to get them in the ground, and they're really fighting that leggy part of things and to give them enough. So that's where you can bury them a little bit more to give them some more stability. And then placing plants outside where they will receive wind protection and a couple hours of sunlight and gradually exposing them more and more to that sunlight over, like this is kind of at the beginning, end of May, depending on how the weather is. But you want to bring them indoors at night for temperatures that approach freezing, so 32 degrees. Even if I'm seeing like 38, 40, that's my minimum. 40 is like my minimum at night. If it's less than 40, I'm absolutely gonna always be bringing them in. And if I have this many seeds, I am not even gonna do that. I might open the windows and then close the windows. There's your exposure. So just know that if that's like impractical for you, don't do it. And I also like here, she uses like wax paper on this seed starting right there. So again, creating that greenhousing effect with something that she already has and doesn't have to go out of her way to spend a bunch on. This is actually the guy who gave us our elderberries, so you might know him from around here, Bill. This is his seed starting operation. He was very proud, and he's like, do you want to take pictures of this and put it in your class? I'm like, absolutely, Bill. So you can see he loves what he does, and he only does a half acre. I mean, I shouldn't say only, but he uses a whole half acre of his land and produces literally thousands of pounds of food. So he has a little farm stand out in Johnson Creek and he does it kind of as an operation. So this is a little bit of a bigger setup, but you can see he likes using like these PVC pipes, and then he's got these chains where you can lower it a little bit. And then another thing on the bottom right, you can kind of see there's a drip tray underneath, or like he used actually like an oil drip tray from like for cars and stuff. That's a great hack actually, is to use an oil drip tray. Or if I see like the big cafeteria, like food prep trays, the big ones, I'll grab some of those sometimes. Because it's nice to have, because when you can see there's a heat mat down here, and then you see these seedlings are in another drip tray on top of it, but know that water is gonna get some places. So having some water protection is a good insurance, especially for if you have stuff underneath, you don't wanna get dirty. What's up,
What
Sid?
is he growing?
So he has probably a ton of different tomatoes and peppers. That's some of the main things he does. But then he'll also do like zucchini and squash and onions, and yeah, they've been growing a long time. And so he's what you would consider like a traditional farmer. He does his rows, he does his lines, and he does everything in, you know, very orderly fashion. And so it's nice to see how he does his operation, but know that that's a big overhaul. I do maybe a tiny percentage of that because I have a small yard comparatively. Now, tools for starting, if you plan on starting seeds, the biggest thing is to have a space indoors dedicated towards this. So I might not have a ton of space, but if I have like a 3x4 table, if I have a small enough space that I can put a light with it, start some seed trays, and know that eventually I can put these into bigger pots and move them outside, put them in some greenhousing effects, some cold frame things, that can all add up on there. So I talk about, you know, using seed starting trays, having your potting soils, having a fan, labels and markers, heat mats, germination domes, but know that this is all pretty much for the most part optional. So find what feels best for you. If you have egg cartons that you want to start seeds in and you just have a south-facing window, you're still gonna be okay. You might not have as much germination, you might not have as perfect of growth, but I'd much rather you play and try and learn than say, oh, I can't do seeds because I don't have enough space for it. I don't have Bill's big conjunction, you know, collaboration thing. So it's cool to see different different growers and gardeners have their way of doing this stuff. So everyone's seed starting is gonna look a little different. Now, transplanting. When we transplant outdoors, you want to make sure it's after all danger of frost has passed. So they're saying May 11th, like Mother's Day. My grandma used to always say Memorial Day. So usually sometime in between those two, or maybe a little after, is in general where you want to be. And then watering plants well before transplanting versus having them already kind of be in a dehydrated, wilty little state and then stressing them out by moving them. So you want them to be ready to rock. And then if necessary to support your plants in the future, you'd much rather put those supports in the ground right away when you're planting it than have to dig them open and take up some of those roots. So like if you're doing a string trellis, like where you have a string right next to your tomato plant, put that string in the ground and bury it right with it versus putting it in later and trying to like mix it in there. Now, if plants were growing in a community pack or a container, just cutting that soil, you don't have to necessarily worry about pulling all those roots separately because they're gonna come, it's gonna be able to be okay. Now, with a hand shovel, make a large hole, large enough for the root ball to transplant. And this is a great time when you're transplanting, if it's, you know, the size of your pot, maybe going a little bit bigger than what you have and adding any compost or any little soil amendments, be it Milorganite, be it whatever little fertilizers you want to use, or maybe it's your drainage materials. So like if I have tomatoes I just bought at the store and I have a pot full, like I have a container in my back patio that I'm ready to put the tomatoes in, maybe I add a little bit of my wood chip or twigs or leaf mold just to give that drainage spot for water right away. So that's a tiny little thing. You don't have to do that. You can never do that and you'll probably be fine, but it's something to consider. And then firming the soil just around the roots. So you don't want to leave it all loose and ready to rock. So you just tap it down a little bit. And then there's a nice little link too about if you want to save seed from vegetables. It goes over a ton of those things, which I wish I could go through everything with you guys, but I know I'm not going to be able, in the time that we have. So I know it's 12:32 right now. So basically I want to give you guys this little bit of homework to start checking nurseries in the area, seeing when they're going to open up, maybe start sourcing your seeds, maybe start preparing some space, and possibly start growing some spring hardy plants. So yeah, when you're ready, you guys are ready to rock on, and then hopefully I get to see you in 2 weeks from now. So thank you guys for coming in. This is just a little thing talking about how it's always exciting. Thank you guys.